going to enjoy it, damn it. Emeritus Fellow of New College, Oxford, Richard Dawkins was the University of Oxford Professor of Public Understanding of Science from 1995 to 2008. He's also the creator of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, and we have to applaud that in these dark times. Professor Dawkins is, of course, also an influential evolutionary biologist and really, truly, I don't say this very often, but one of the finest science writers I genuinely believe of all time. I very much enjoyed, yes, absolutely, rereading his books, and some of them for the first time, admittedly, these past few weeks, has reminded me just how beautiful his works are. And we're honored to have Richard here to mark some base 10 anniversaries because we have 10 fingers. We like the base 10 number system. It is the 40th anniversary of the selfish gene. The 30th anniversary of the blind watchmaker. The 20th, I'm going to talk before you guys clap. The 20th anniversary of climbing Mount Improbable. The 10th anniversary of the God Delusion. It is the year of the second edition of The Ancestor's Tale, true, and the year of the paperback edition of Brief Candle in the Dark. So let's welcome our guest, Richard Dawkins. This must be kind of a strange time to come to America.
Yeah, indeed.
I was kind of surprised you showed up, actually. I half thought you weren't coming.
It's a catastrophe. The world will, I mean, it's one thing for Americans to vote the way they do, but the world is going to suffer. He's announced his intention to withdraw from the Paris Accords on climate change, and that is going to be very serious for the entire world and probably forever. Within the United States, the Supreme Court is going to go on for a very, the crisis caused by his appointments to the Supreme Court will go on a very long time, because Supreme Court justices don't have to retire. And so it can go on much, much longer than the 4 years, which obviously we all hope he doesn't have more than 4 years. So it's a catastrophe. It's a magnified version of the catastrophe in Britain, which is Brexit, and they've got something in common. I don't know what the solution is. I'm not American. Part of the problem seems to be the electoral college system, whichever way you look at it, seems to be utterly dopey. I can't understand how anybody could possibly defend.
That's a technical term, right? Yeah.
By the way, I need to make a little apology for my voice, which may get worse. I'll do it in verse. Please forgive me if I croak. It's because I've had a stroke. Basal ganglion on the right makes me walk as if I'm tight. So if I sink to groans and squawking, Janna will have to do the talking.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that. I want to talk more about this current political crisis, but in the context of some of your ideas. And so I want to take a step back before we do that and talk about the selfish gene first before we approach the idea of the cultural meme. And of course, in the selfish gene, you very lucidly explain how chance and natural selection collude to move evolution forward in this very slow and progressive way. But you also make a very subtle point, which is that it's not really animals trying to preserve the species that's at stake, but something about the gene, individual genes trying to survive. And I think this is so subtle and interesting, I'd like to draw that out again.
Right. Obviously everybody here understands that a word like trying is to be understood as having quotation marks around it. Life looks as though it's trying to achieve something. I'm getting a bit of echo, aren't I? Is that okay? A bit of ringing?
Are you guys hearing echo? It might be just something we have to tolerate given our three-story ceilings.
Okay. Natural selection is the survival of something, as opposed to rival versions which are less successful. And the thing about genes is that they are potentially immortal. Because a gene makes copies of itself, and the copies go on through generation after generation after generation, the gene is potentially immortal in the form of copies of itself. Now that means that the difference between a successful gene, one that does manage to survive and make copies of itself, and an unsuccessful gene really matters, because it goes on forever. A body can be regarded as, I call it, a survival machine for the genes that ride inside it. The body is not eternal, the body dies.
That's very disappointing news. Yeah.
This week I'm
you
not
were the
so
deliverer
sure
of
about
lots
that.
of bad news.
Yeah. The body dies and leaves behind it the instructions that made it. And so instructions that are good at building bodies, bodies that are good at surviving and reproducing, are the ones that do survive. And so obviously the world becomes full of genes which are good at building bodies, bodies that are good at surviving and good at reproducing. Look at it another way, look at it backwards. Every creature alive today is descended from an unbroken line of successful ancestors, not one of whom died young, and every one of whom managed to achieve at least one heterosexual copulation. Millions of rival animals failed in either of those endeavors or both. Millions of animals have died young, millions of animals failed to attract a mate, but the minority that did survive childhood and did attract a mate and did reproduce and did achieve parental care, whatever it was necessary for the species, they are the ones that pass the genes on. And so every creature alive is built by that subset of genes which are good at it, and that's why different species are good at different things. Birds are good at flying, fish are good at swimming, monkeys are good at climbing, horses are good at galloping, lions are good at catching, and so on. So every species does it in a different way, but they're all doing fundamentally the same thing, which is preserving the genes that ride inside them. So if an animal dies, the genes die with it. If an animal survives, the genes survive to reproduce, and that is natural selection. So that's the meaning of the central message of the selfish gene.
You have this emphasis in that book on the idea that the gene creates a vehicle to continue to carry it through life, and that vehicle is us, it's plants, it's animals. Did I understand correctly that there was a Japanese translation of the book?
Yes. Yeah, I know the story you're thinking of, yes. I was visited by a Japanese television crew. They came to Oxford from London in a London taxi, a black cab. And they came, a whole lot of them in one taxi, and they had sort of tripods and arms and legs and things waving out of all the windows. It was a very full taxi. And the director, the first thing that happened was that the official interpreter was unable to make himself understood in English, and so he was kind of banished to go, and I don't know what, he was rather sad, really. And the director had enough English to tell me that he wanted me to conduct the interview in the taxi. So I said, why the taxi? And he said, are you not author of Taxicab Theory of Evolution? And I said, well, I don't think so. And I afterwards worked out that it must have been that the translation of the word vehicle, I've used the word, the body is the vehicle of the genes, and I think that must have been translated as taxicab. Anyway,
it's catchy.
Because the interpreter was not very good at making himself understood in English, I had nobody to interview me, and so I was alone in the taxi with the cameraman, the director was very keen that the taxi should go through the scenic part of Oxford and have good background to my interview. So I had to ad-lib the interview, pretending that I'd been asked questions by the interviewer. But I also had to, since it was a London taxi driver who didn't know his way around Oxford, I had to, I was sitting with my back to the driver. You know, London taxis have this sort of little seat at the facing backwards. So I was expounding the selfish gene, and at the same time leaning over my shoulder and saying, "Turn left here," and "Turn right at the traffic lights." Yeah, well, that's that story, the taxi cab thing.
So these stories are in your most recent book, is that right?
I've just published 2 autobiographies. Yeah. The first one, it takes me up to the it's called An Appetite for Wonder, and it takes me up to the selfish gene when I was 35. And the second one, Brief Candle in the Dark, which you'll recognize as a combination of Shakespeare and Carl Sagan.
Indeed, we totally all recognized that completely. Yes. Everyone here.
You all take your illusions, I'm sure. I seem to have started croaking. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes, I think the taxi cab story is in one of those, probably the second one.
So despite this argument that genes are selfish and that it's really the gene that's trying to propagate, not the entire species, nonetheless, species do survive. And so there's some cooperation that happens, and you explain it very eloquently as a kind of game theory, exposition of why individually selfish genes nonetheless cooperate so that the species doesn't go completely extinct, so that we reach some kind of stable condition.
Species survive as an indirect consequence of gene survival. So at no stage does natural selection work for the survival of the species. Natural selection works for the survival of individual genes, and mostly that means the species lasts for a while. Most species do actually eventually go extinct. So it would be a mistake to say that cooperation, which is very common in animals, that cooperation has something to do with preserving the species. It doesn't. Cooperation is all about preserving genes like everything else. But there are good selfish gene reasons why individuals cooperate. So much of the book, The Selfish Gene, is actually about cooperation, about altruism. Individual cooperation and individual altruism is fostered by selfish genes, partly by the kinship effect, partly by the fact that close kin share genes, and so a gene that makes an animal care for its close kin is actually preserving copies of itself. And that's why parental care works, of course, and it's why care of siblings, nephews and nieces, and so on also works. But the other reason is the one that you referred to, Janna, which is a sort of game theoretic reason, reciprocation, cooperation, because each party benefits from the other. We have a non-zero-sum game, for those who know the theory, such that because each party benefits, individuals who cooperate with the other side, which could be a member of a different species, even a different kingdom. I mean, cooperation between, say, bees and flowers. You can regard that as a game theoretic cooperation. Each side has something to gain from the other. And so individual bees, individual flowers that cooperate are the ones that survive, or their genes survive, in competition with rival bee genes or rival flower genes, which don't cooperate with the other side in the symbiotic relationship.
This very influential idea and word that you coin, and I think is relevant for us to think about today. And I think people would appreciate hearing about the genesis of the idea of the meme in your own words, the cultural meme, as an analog to genetic transmission.
The whole of the rest of the book, The Selfish Gene, was about the gene as the unit of selection, and so there was a danger that the reader would be left with the impression that genes are DNA is the only kind of self-replicating entity which could serve as the basis for Darwinian natural selection. I wanted to make the point that any sufficiently high fidelity replicator, sufficiently high fidelity and with sufficient power over its own chances of being replicated, could serve as the basis for natural selection. And for example, if there's life on other planets, I would bet my shirt on it being Darwinian life. And that, I think, means there's got to be something equivalent to DNA, but it probably isn't DNA. It's no doubt some other kind of self-replicating entity. To dramatize the point that other kinds of self-replicating entity might serve as the basis for Darwinian selection, I coined the meme, which is the cultural unit of inheritance. Inheritance in culture really means imitation, the passing on of an idea or a clothes fashion. I think I used the example of a backwards baseball cap, which spreads like an epidemic. It's well known to lower the IQ by at least 10 points.
What about green socks and red socks?
I'll tell you about that if you really want to know.
Of course we want to know.
Okay. It's the tyranny of making us buy socks in pairs that shoes have chirality. That means that a right shoe and a left shoe are not interchangeable. Socks don't have chirality. You don't need to buy a pair of socks. You don't need to buy a pair of socks such that if you lose one of them, you have to throw the other one away. How ridiculous is that? You should just buy a sack full of socks and then just choose any two at random. So I'm trying to dramatize the point by wearing socks that are rather ostentatiously not a pair. By the way, I just attended a conference in Las Vegas of skeptics, and one of the things skeptics are interested in is cold reading, the technique whereby fakes and charlatans pretend to be talking to the dead or something like that, and they seem to be reading the minds of the audience or reading the minds of the dead. And what they're really doing is cold reading. They're picking up on cues from the audience. And in this workshop at this conference, we had to pair off with just random people in the audience and read each other. And I was paired with a very nice young woman, and we had to read each other. And, well, I first of all read her, and I said, I think I'm getting somewhere on the West Coast. I think probably not California, could be probably not Washington State. I think somewhere in between. I would say perhaps you come from Oregon. And I was, of course, just reading the name badge on her. But then she then read me, and she said, I'm getting some sort of problem with the eyes. I think you've got some kind of problem with your eyes. Colorblind, perhaps. So I'm trying to spread the meme of odd socks, the more ostentatiously odd the better, to free us, liberate us from the tyranny of socks in pairs. And by the way, just before I finish on that, although I said that shoes have chirality and you can't swap the left and right shoes, I do have one rather shaming anecdote. A few years ago, I was doing a television program, documentary, called Sex, Death, and the Meaning of Life. And in the film on death, I had to walk along a cliff path on Beachy Head, which is a very high cliff, gigantic cliff in southern England, which is a famous suicide place. Lots and lots of unfortunate, unhappy people have launched themselves off the cliff. And all the way along the cliff path are little low crosses, only about knee-high, marking the place where somebody has jumped over. And for the film, I had to walk slowly and rather mournfully along this path, meditating on death as I passed these little low crosses. And the camera was focused on my feet in close-up as I walked past these sad little crosses. And my feet were incredibly uncomfortable. And I couldn't understand. It was this uncanny feeling, this was spooky surreal feeling of uncomfortable feet. And I couldn't understand what it was. And eventually, the shot came to an end. The director called cut, and I was able to go and sit down and take my shoes off. And then I realized that I'd put them on the wrong way round. This is all preserved in close-up.
I'm not sure we should trust your opinion anymore, but on the topic of the meme, you have this quite beautiful phrasing, which I want to quote from a chapter in The Selfish Gene. And I think this is very important for us now when we're thinking about the past week, with that in mind. So you write, even if we look on the dark side and assume that individual man is fundamentally selfish, our conscious foresight, our capacity to simulate the future in imagination, could save us from the worst selfish excesses of the blind replicators. And you're talking both about the gene, but also about the cultural meme.
Yes. It is a remarkable fact that although foresight is such an important part of what we do, and we can actually look ahead, we can actually look to the future, we can actually predict that if we go on if we go on with
that sort of thing happens here a lot. We just
fostering global warming and the Arctic and Antarctic ice caps melt and the sea level rises, we can forecast that we're in for a major disaster. Forecasting is something that only humans do. No other animal is capable of having that kind of prophetic vision of the consequences of future of actions in the future. So I was trying to make the point that humans are uniquely capable of withdrawing from the kind of tyranny it is of the selfish genes and the selfish memes, which drive all other species towards short-term gain, short-term selfish gain at the expense of long-term welfare. Now, not all humans do this, not all humans can do this or want to do it, but at least we are capable of doing it. And it does require a kind of rebellion against the selfish genes and the selfish memes, and we can do it. And many of us appreciate that and actually do curb our selfish desires, short-term selfish desires, and give greater priority to long-term, we could call them ultimately selfish, but anyway, long-term aims, long-term goals, long-term welfare. So that's what I meant by that passage. It's much criticized by people who think that the very idea of the selfish gene precludes the possibility of rebelling against them. I don't get the logic of that at all.
Just to continue in that same passage, and this actually I found quite moving under the circumstances. You say, we have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth and, if necessary, the selfish memes of our indoctrination. And I think the question that a lot of us are facing is how? How do we face such insidious memes of indoctrination that can derail 50 million people? I mean, how do we combat the memes? They evolve faster, they grab quicker in the mind. The evolution of memes is faster in some sense than genes, and
yes.
More difficult.
Yes, I mean, obviously you'll have gathered that, like I'm sure everybody here, I have my views about the recent election, but I'm not sure that the meme analysis is going to help us much with that. I think it does help with the selfish memes of our indoctrination. That really, I had religion in mind there, where children are indoctrinated with ideas which have no merit, but which have come down to them through their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, priests, teachers, a cultural tradition, tribal tradition, and so on. I called it a virus. I've called religion viruses of the mind, because they do spread rather like a viral epidemic, both sideways when a charismatic preacher infects large numbers of people who infect other people by preaching religious nonsense. And longitudinally, when children are indoctrinated with the traditional beliefs of their culture, of their parents and grandparents, and so on, this is obviously going on. I mean, you'd predict from that what you would see would be that in different parts of the world there would be different nonsensical traditions. In Arabia, it's Islamic nonsense. In Italy, it's Christian nonsense. And in South America, it is. In Burma, it's Buddhist and so on. So these viral ideas get passed down through the generations because children at a vulnerable age are indoctrinated by their parents or by their teachers. And they just believe what they're told. They believe what they're told because that's what children's brains do. And many of them never manage to shake free of it. And so they're told that if they behave badly, they'll go to hell, which is a terrible thing to tell a child, and many of us shake it off, but some of us don't. And so this viral idea takes over the brain, takes over the mind, and in some cases can cause deep unhappiness.
You discuss in The Blind Watchmaker this idea that, of course, complex life looks so stunningly designed that it leaves the impression that there was a designer, and of course this is not at all necessary in the theory of evolution, where in these slow and minute steps, one at a time, you can make the most complex organisms. But you actually go further also in the God delusion to discuss probabilities, that one theory is true and one theory is not true. You consider the God question, in other words, to be a scientifically answerable question in terms of whether or not it has merit as a theory.
Yes. Well, the first thing to say is, yes, you're perfectly right that the illusion of design that living things present is stunning. It really is, and many people don't realize quite how stunning it is. If you look at the detailed anatomy of living organisms, you look at their behavior, it looks as though it's beautifully designed for the purpose of helping the animal to survive and reproduce. And beautiful sometimes is no exaggeration in the case of sexually selected characteristics which are designed to attract the opposite sex, usually to attract the female sex. These are, even to human eyes, beautiful and extravagant, magnificent, and natural selection can do it. And you said, Janna, that a creator is not necessary for that. Well, it certainly is not necessary because natural selection can do it. But I think it's also worse than unnecessary. It's improbable in a gigantic way, because the whole enterprise, the whole Darwinian enterprise, is to explain the complex illusion of design in living organisms by naturalistic means, by the slow, gradual, incremental, step-by-step, cumulative evolution from simple beginnings. That is an amazingly powerful idea. And if you talk about a designer, a creator, then you are undermining the whole scientific enterprise, because you're postulating something which has, namely a creator, which has to be another such complicated, elegantly designed thing. So you've completely pulled the rug out from the whole scientific enterprise. You've postulated exactly what you're trying to explain, which is something complicated and apparently designed. A God capable of designing a heart or an ear. The same goes too for when physicists talk about the fine-tuning of the universe. The idea that the fundamental physical constants, the gravitational constant and the weak force and so on, that these are, as it were, knobs that get twiddled, rheostats that get twiddled to give exactly the right value. If the gravitational constant was ever so slightly different from what it is, you wouldn't have a universe as we know it. You wouldn't have galaxies, you wouldn't have stars, you wouldn't have chemistry, and so on. And so they attempted to postulate an intelligent designer, a divine knob twiddler, who twiddles the knobs. Thank you. Who twiddles the knobs to get exactly the right value. You have explained absolutely nothing when you said that, because you're left with explaining, instead of having to explain why the physical constants themselves have the values that they do, you have to explain how a God capable of knowing how to twiddle the knobs came into existence. So you've explained nothing.
So of course the multiverse suggestion is that there are so many universes and that those numbers are random, that only in those universes where natural selection works and evolution works and creatures evolve on at least one planet able to reflect on those numbers, ask the questions. So the question then becomes, how likely are we pre-programmed with the creation of the universe?
Well, we have to be on the multiverse theory, we invoke the anthropic principle and say we have to be in one of that minority of universes where the physical constants do have the appropriate values to bring us into existence, and that's sort of obvious. But Janna, you're a physicist and I'm not, but I understand that physicists have other reasons for postulating a multiverse. It's not that they invent the multiverse for that purpose. There are other reasons in the inflation theory which predict that there will be a multiverse, and so it's a much better theory than it sounds at first sight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we won't go into the details of this, but the anthropic argument, which is sort of the one we're vaguely floating, was postulated before the better reason.
Yeah.
And it was very unpopular for good reason. Yet sometimes ideas are floated for wrong reasons and eventually come around again because there's something to them. But on a side note, on a digression, why is it that in the animal kingdom it's the males that are always dressed up and glamorous?
Okay.
And for human beings?
Yeah, okay.
Why are the females always trying to dress up? Look, I'm not making gendered comments. You all know what I mean. It's just a curious facet of the animal kingdom.
Yeah. Humans might be an exception to this, but in most animals, you're right, that it is the male that does it. The fundamental reason seems to be that the female sex is the economically valuable sex.
We knew that.
And you can see this it starts with the fact that the egg is large and the sperm is small. And so the female has already committed a large economic cost to the reproductive effort with making each egg. So from an economic point of view, if a male can get a female, he's got a prize, an economic prize, an economically valuable prize. If a female gets a male, she hasn't got a prize because he contributes rather little, and she could easily get another one. So that's fundamentally why sexual competition is mostly competition among males for females rather than the other way around. Sometimes that competition takes the form of overt fighting, males fighting other males for possession of often a harem of females. At other times, it's a battle of attractiveness. Males have beautiful plumage, beautiful coloration, beautiful songs as a luring device to lure females directly. And but the answer to your question is an economic one.
On this issue of the slow, gradual climbing of, as you describe it, Mount Improbable, which is also a title of one of your books, Climbing of Mount Improbable, there have been notable examples in the history of biology where there was a sudden advance. And this came up in a recent conversation that we had here called Are We Alone?, where we discussed the emergence of life on Earth and this singular event when single-celled organisms were waffling on the earth for billions of years. And then there's this symbiotic event where two very disparate organisms with two different DNA merge and create a complex organism, and every creature on the earth descends, or complex organism, descends from that event. There's a lurch forward suddenly.
Yes. Most evolutionary change is properly described as gradual. So almost all the evolution of the vertebrates and so on is gradual. There may be one or two highly important, significant lurches, as you say, jumps in evolution. And probably the most important of all is the one you mentioned, the origin of the eukaryotic cell. The eukaryotic cell is the cell that we are all made of, all animals are made of, all plants are made of, all fungi are made of, many protozoa are made of. Really everything except bacteria and archaea, although that's a very large number of, a very large biomass. But the eukaryotic cell has a nucleus, it has mitochondria, which are small bodies that make energy, that metabolize. And in the case of plants, chloroplasts, which are small bodies that do, small green bodies that do photosynthesis. It is now known that mitochondria and chloroplasts are actually bacteria. They were originally bacteria which billions of years ago entered into a symbiotic cooperative relationship with another kind of cell and provided biochemical expertise which enabled the cell to flourish and survive. In the case of the chloroplasts, the biochemical expertise that these bacteria provided was photosynthesis. So all the photosynthesis that is done in green plants everywhere, in trees, in cabbages, in tomatoes, everything, all the photosynthesis is done by these symbiotic bacteria, chloroplasts. They've become so integrated into the plant cells that it's only recently been understood that they actually are bacteria. They have their own DNA, mitochondrial DNA, chloroplast DNA. They reproduce by binary fission, by just splitting in two inside the cell. So every cell in a plant has a population of separately reproducing chloroplasts. A bit later in evolution, there was another event of the same kind, when another kind of bacteria came into the cell as mitochondria. And mitochondria are present in all our animal cells, and they metabolize and provide us with energy. Once again, it was only relatively recently understood that they are originally bacteria. Once again, they have their own DNA. They reproduce autonomously by splitting, just like bacteria do. And they're very useful for doing genetic histories because, unlike the rest of our genes, they're not reassorted by sexual recombination. They reproduce asexually. They pass from generation to generation only down the female line. So all of us have mitochondria, but we all get them from our mother, from our maternal grandmother, from our maternal great-grandmother, and so on. So whereas if we look back in our genetic history, all the rest of our genes, except the Y chromosome, all the rest of our genes come from an enormous variety of different ancestors, millions of different ancestors pooling their DNA through sexual reproduction to make each one of us. Mitochondria aren't like that. Mitochondrial DNA trickles down the generations in a narrow stream, which is the maternal line. And what that means is that you really can trace the origin of your mitochondrial DNA. You really can ask yourself the question, how close a cousin am I to this individual or that individual if you take only the mitochondrial DNA? And fascinatingly, not all that surprisingly, it turns out that there are only about 20 families of mitochondria. So we're all, those of us of European descent come from only about 7 different, as it were, mitochondrial tribes. And you can say, if you like, that we are descended from one of 7 females, one of 7 individual females who is the progenitor of our particular mitochondrial tribe. You could arrange football matches between mitochondrial tribes.
We should think about that when we talk about closing our borders in tough times. I get to a section in every one of these conversations, which I call the hard stuff, where none of us are on solid ground, and where we're just using the best that we can, the best that we know, to try to extend ideas beyond today and beyond what we know now. So, for instance, things that I think we worry about are, or we can ask about, have to do with whether or not we're still evolving under the influence of natural selection, or are we evolving under the influence of an artificial selection now? What does it mean to have not just medical intervention, but also things like genetic editing, which has become, as people like to say, cheaper and faster and easier and more prevalent? What are the prospects of artificial selection and artificial evolution?
Yes, well, artificial mutation, which is what you're talking about when you talk about genetic manipulation, that's something for the future. It's just beginning, and it can be done and will be done probably in the future. Artificial selection is something that, rather oddly, we haven't done really much with humans. We've done it with cabbages and cows and dogs. And horses and pigs. All our domestic animals, all our domestic plants and crops and garden flowers, they've all been modified pretty drastically by artificial selection. When you think that a Pekingese or a Chihuahua is a wolf, and still thinks it's a wolf in some sense. So that's a very major change, which could have been done with humans but hasn't. So we haven't produced the equivalent of Pekingeses and poodles in humans. And so possibly, if we didn't have the will to do that, and I'm glad we didn't, maybe we don't have the will to do it with the mutation half of evolution as well.
So you don't worry about a future where babies are selected on the basis of their genetic breakdown?
Hitler tried to do a bit of that, sort of breeding a race of blonde, blue-eyed Nordic human types, and didn't get anywhere with it. And the kind of Hitler eugenics where it was compulsory, and there's compulsory sterilization and so on, is of course utterly odious and obnoxious. But you could imagine doing it with IVF, in vitro fertilization, where, in in vitro fertilization, what you do is hyperstimulate a woman's ovaries to produce lots of eggs, maybe a dozen eggs, and you fertilize them in a dish. And so you've got perhaps 10 8-cell embryos in this dish, and you have to put some of them back, maybe 2 of them back, in the hope that one of them will survive. That's how it works. It's possible to remove 1 cell from the 8-cell embryo. It doesn't damage the embryo, funnily enough, and you can then look at the genes of the embryo. So instead of putting back a random pair, which is what's done at present, back into the woman, you could choose to put back embryos that are free of haemophilia, say, if the couple is known to be at risk of haemophilia, or Huntington's disease, which is a very horrible dominant gene. So I think almost nobody would object to that if you've got a couple who are in danger of passing on Huntington's disease or haemophilia or some such hereditary affliction. Rather than put back embryos at random, you would put back embryos non-randomly, choosing those that don't have the offending gene. Well, it's a small step from that to go from negative eugenics to positive eugenics, where you say to the couple, do you have any particular preference? Would you like to have a musical child, say? It can't be done at present because we can't identify. the J.S. Bach gene or whatever. But if we could, then it seems not unreasonable that a couple might say to the doctor, well, don't just put back any old embryo, put back the one that has the musical gene or genes. A lot of people find that offensive, but the same people don't find it so offensive when parents who are ambitious for the musical future of their children make them take piano lessons and make them practice for an hour a day. So the environmental engineering of a child towards a musical career is regarded as pretty acceptable, whereas the genetic one is not, and that's just worth thinking about as to why that is.
Nowhere in the Darwinian theory is there any suggestion that intelligent life is in any way a pinnacle or in any way an endpoint of evolution. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that we're not that successful as a species. So are we merely a step along the way? Are we here to change the environment so that it is inhospitable to mammals and totally radioactive so that only roaches live here in the future? I mean, what is our ultimate role in terms of the larger scheme of the planet? Is it clear?
I shrink from are we here to do something, or I shrink from a word like role. We're here because we're here, like all animals. Intelligence on our level, linguistic intelligence, the ability to use language to talk about things that are not immediately present, talk about philosophy and science and things. This is an utterly unique human capability. There are occasional, bees can talk about how far away the food is and what direction it is, but no other species can discuss the philosophy of Wittgenstein or something like that. So language seems to be, grammatical, syntactic, hierarchically embedded language seems to be a uniquely human faculty. It's only happened once. If you look around the animal kingdom and ask how many times other things have evolved, eyes have evolved many, many, many times, dozens of times independently. Echolocation, the trick that bats use to navigate in total darkness using echoes and processing the echoes with sophisticated computational apparatus so that they actually more or less can see with their ears. That's evolved 4 times. Bats, toothed whales and dolphins, and 2 separate families of birds, both of which live in caves. So,
do you think they color code sound? I've always wondered this.
Yes.
Do they assign a color to the frequency of the sound, like we do to light?
That is a very, very radical suggestion, which I've been pushing for some years, and it's impossible to test. But I think it's worth suggesting because color, the hue that we see, the sensation of redness, the qualia, are labels that the brain uses to identify light of particular wavelengths. So there's nothing inherently red about long wavelengths, nothing inherently blue about short wavelengths. These are simply labels that the brain uses in its internal modeling of the world to give, to interpret the wavelength of light. Now, bats have pretty much lost the sense of vision, not totally, but almost completely. But their ancestors had color vision, not as good as ours, but they certainly had 2-color vision. What's the brain going to do with this labeling facility that it has in the brain? Why not use the same labels to tie to echolocation sensations, perhaps texture, perhaps use the label red for a hard, shiny surface like that of a locust, and use the label blue for a soft, furry surface like that of a moth. This is total speculation, but why would it not use those labels since they're there and available? And similarly, maybe rhinoceroses and dogs smell in color.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to be lost in reverie, but I forgot I was up here. I have one last question before we open it up to the Q&A, and I'm sure the audience is really excited to ask you questions themselves. But this idea of artificial intelligence being designed by human beings strikes me as suffering from some of the same problems you raise in the God delusion, which is the designer who could create such a complex intelligence would have to be incredibly complex. So if we are not, as human beings, capable of designing a very, very complex, sophisticated intelligence, is it something we'd be better off seeing evolve in a natural way, but digitally? Like, is there an artificial intelligence right now evolving on the internet by a blind watchmaker, and it has nothing to do with us?
Well, that's a possibility, but I think you exaggerate the problem, because it's not really like the problem of the divine creator. We're already perfectly familiar with the idea that in certain fields, the computers we create are capable of outstripping us in a big way. The designer of a chess-playing program, the programmer of a program that can beat a grandmaster, which we now have, is not a grandmaster himself. He couldn't beat the program himself, but he's a very good programmer. So, and similarly, obviously, we know that computers can do computations much, much faster than we can, although they're designed by humans. Humans design them to do very, very fast calculations, many, many orders of magnitude faster than they can do themselves. So that's not a problem. But I think you're right to suggest that the sinister implications that some people like Stephen Hawking foresee, and I think Elon Musk maybe as well, stem from the possibility that robotic intelligence could take off in its own right and evolve beyond the capabilities which the human designers originally intended, and perhaps eventually take over the world. And who knows, they might do a better job than we do.
On that note, can we thank Richard and then open it up for questions? We've left a generous amount of time for questions. I can't really see people that well. Do we have a mic?
Do we have the lights up? Can we have the lights up?
Yeah, maybe we can have the lights up so we can see the audience. And do we have a mic for people who have questions, or did we steal the mic? We might have stolen the mic.
We've got a mic.
Okay. Can we get a little bit of the house lights up so we can see?
Let there be light.
Where are you, person? You can go ahead and ask from the darkness. It's kind of interesting. I don't know, it feels kind of metaphorical. What do you got? Ah, there we go. Nice. Thanks. Did somebody have a first question?
Hand up here.
Do we have a mic? Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, hey. Hey, thanks for coming and talking. Thank you. So, yeah, I have a maybe political question. I'm curious about your take on the secularity laws in France. You're not allowed to wear any sort of religious symbol or icon in a public school. And whether imposing such a, enforcing secularity is any different than like a fundamental, religious rule.
Well, if the word you used was secularity, that just means absence of religious indoctrination. That's not indoctrination in its own right. That's encouraging critical thinking. It's encouraging the constitutional, in this country at least, separation of church and state. So encouraging children to think for themselves is the very opposite of indoctrination. You're not telling them what to think, you're telling them how to think. So I think I would repudiate the suggestion, but I may have misheard the word. I think it was secularity. At first I thought it was circularity.
I think it was secularity.
Yes, okay.
Hi.
Yes.
I used to work for the Richard Dawkins Foundation. I was the coordinator for the Inherit the Win project, which was a theater project that we gave money to do the Scopes trial in different public schools. And I'm wondering, because we're here in Pioneer Works, if you could tell us a little bit about what you think the intersection between art and science is, and if you have any projects that you think we should look into or support.
Well, thank you. Yes, one of the projects of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science is indeed the sponsoring of productions in schools of the play Inherit the Wind, which is about the Scopes trial of 1926. This is the 90th anniversary of the Scopes trial, where a man called John Scopes, a science teacher, was tried for the crime of teaching evolution. There was a famous film made of the play Inherit the Wind, starring Spencer Tracy as the great lawyer Clarence Darrow, which I strongly recommend. It's a very powerful film. It's a powerful play. And we are sponsoring school productions of this play as a way of opening eyes to evolution and the importance of it educationally. It's just one example of the marrying of art and science, of which this building here is a spectacular another example. It's something that is somewhat dear to my heart. I wrote a book called Unweaving the Rainbow in 1998, I think, which is about the poetry of science, and it's about almost the spiritual quality of science in a non-supernatural sense of spirit. I do think that science is a wonderful vehicle for poetic writing, for poetry indeed, and prose poetry and great literature. I sort of wonder a bit why the Nobel Prize for Literature has, I think, never gone to a scientist. It usually goes to novelists and poets. It is not clear to me, much as I like novels, it's not clear to me why literature seems to be confined to, the idea of literature seems to be confined often to fiction, which means things that never happened, rather than to fact. And so why not have scientists getting the Nobel Prize for Literature?
There's been a very interesting suggestion also that major scientific collaborations should be considered for the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, precisely because they transcend international boundaries.
That's a good point, yes.
And they draw together people under sort of one sky in one global aim, and there's very few other examples of that.
Yeah.
Here comes a mic.
Hey, it's great to have you up here. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to know, it's actually a two-parter, what's the most dangerous place that you've been to as an atheist, and what place have you gone to that's been a great time for you to be an atheist?
Well, Pioneer Works is...
I actually enjoy going and lecturing in the so-called Bible Belt of this country. I enjoy going to the Deep South. It never seems to be dangerous. I seem to draw quite large crowds in the Deep South, and I think you can guess the reason if you think about it. I mean, the kind of people who come to my talks they feel beleaguered. They feel surrounded by people who are not their own kind, and they come to my talk, and they suddenly look around and they see a couple of thousand people who think like them. And it's a very warm feeling for me. I love doing it. And in the book signing line afterwards, I get the most wonderful comments from people who say, "Oh, you've changed my life. Thank you for coming to Arkansas or Alabama or Georgia, whatever it is." I've never been to Iraq or Iran or Pakistan. And I don't think I'm going to be going there in a hurry. So that probably would be the most dangerous place, but I haven't been there. And the Deep South, the Bible Belt, might be the least dangerous place for me.
It's interesting that we talked about this earlier when we were upstairs, but we don't offer often an alternative to the church just in terms of community, just in terms of that feeling of looking around and feeling like you're with like-minded supporters. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about having cultural institutions that welcome people into their doors, because that's sort of a failing of the naturalist or the humanistic movement in some sense.
Yes, that's right. And so the example I just gave is a good example of sort of one of the things we could be doing. There are attempts to have sort of Sunday services but for non-believers where you have lectures or
Lectures by Richard Dawkins, talks about science.
readings from books or something of that sort, yeah.
Yes, please. Where's our mic runner? You have a question back there? Find someone in the back. While Lauren's finding someone, I do want to ask you, how difficult has it been to have had unpleasant or negative focus as a result of your vocal opinions about atheism?
I have had a certain amount of what you could call hate mail, and I think it's rather fun. I mean, I've done a couple of readings from my hate mail on.
Oh, shame! I should have asked you to bring some. That would have been actually pretty good.
Well, I mean, you can look them up. If you look up Richard Dawkins, I think one of them is called Love Letters to Richard Dawkins, and the other might be called Hate Mail. I'm trying to think of some. I mean, there was one that said, "I hope you die of a painful cancer." Another one said, "I hope you get run over by a church van." But I think, and there's a lot of obscene vituperative language, but I think the champion one is one that that came in too recently to have featured in any of my readings, which is this: "I hope you lose your watch and are late for an important appointment."
First, congratulations on your speedy recovery, and I wish you good health.
Thank you.
Why do you think sociopathy and psychopathy are such winning traits, and what can we do as a society to protect ourselves from it? And second, considering that we have a Supreme Court appointee coming up, and our judicial system is largely based on the idea of religion, do you think that ultimately we shortchange our judicial systems by believing ultimately in karma and God? And in the absence of that, would we in fact have better systems of adjudication?
Well, obviously, yes, I do. I don't have much more to say. I mean, I think you've articulated what I feel, and I feel very pessimistic about it. What was the first half of your question, though? I always blot out this when there are two.
Protecting ourselves from psychopathy and sociopathy.
Psychopathy. I mean, I don't know that there are psychologists who actually say there is a sort of known minority of people in our society who are psychopaths and who don't play by the same rules of empathy that the majority of us have. I mean, most of us feel grief when we see grief in another person. We want to go and comfort them. We want to do something about their misery, give them some comfort, some consolation. But it seems that there's a minority of people, some put it as high as 1/5 of us, who are technically called psychopaths, who don't have that empathy. From a Darwinian point of view, in a way it's a wonder that so many of us do have that empathy, that we're not all psychopaths. So we should be thankful for small mercies. But electing a psychopath president is...
Can we get the mic over here towards the front?
Hi, I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a sore throat. I just wanted to say it's a pleasure to be able to finally hear you speak, by the way, and also to echo the other person's sentiment. Glad that you're recovering well. I was just wondering your opinion about humanistic religion, so to speak, as a third-generation atheist and a current TST member, just your thoughts about community building, and the individualistic mentality among secular groups in the mainstream? If it's
Yes, humanism is a sort of political, social wing of atheism, where atheism is a purely philosophical belief in the absence of supernatural beings. Humanism tries to replace religion by a non-theistic rules for living well, rules for living in a socially pleasant way. I encourage humanism. I'm a member of various humanist organizations, and I encourage people to join humanist groups.
Yes, can we pass that mic? We have time for 2 more questions, I think. 2 more? I see hands everywhere, but no mics. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. I'm over here to your far right. I wanted to just ask what you feel about the rejuvenating extinct species, the kind of ethical dimension around that, as well as is it really something productive in your understanding of how the gene progresses forward, but also certainly the ethical dimension to that as well.
Right. Nowadays, DNA technology is becoming so cheap and quick that it's becoming possible to get a sequence of DNA and they include some extinct ones that have gone extinct sufficiently recently that specimens with DNA can be recovered. Woolly mammoths is an outstanding example, and the woolly mammoth genome is pretty completely known now thanks to the work of the German group under Svante Paabo. There is the hope, the possibility that the mammoth could be brought back by implanting the DNA in the egg of an elephant and bringing it to term in an elephant's uterus. The questioner asks about the ethics of that. I suppose the fear is that it might be cruel to the individual mammoth that was brought back. It would be an object of extreme prurient, I suppose, interest. But probably not much more so than specimens in zoos, and we've seemed to have come to terms with the ethical problems of zoos. So I'm in favor of it. I think the scientific interest would be enormous. I would love to see a revived mammoth. Another one that I'd love to see, which is a possibility, is Thylacinus. That's the Tasmanian wolf, so-called Tasmanian tiger. It looks like a dog, behaved like a dog. We know that because the last one died, only living memory in the 1930s in Hobart Zoo. You can actually see a film of the last thylacine, and you'd think it was a dog. It's obviously a bit different in shape. It's got stripes on the back, which dogs don't have. But it is an uncanny resemblance to a dog. I would love to see the thylacine brought back. And once again, it's such a recent thing that the DNA is possible, and I want it to be done. Jurassic Park, an amazingly ingenious idea by Michael Crichton, the idea that insects preserved in amber might have the blood from their last blood meal preserved, which could have been dinosaur blood. Unfortunately, that dinosaurs died out too long ago, probably, for any DNA to have survived. The film of Jurassic Park ends with a sort of very decisive decision by the scientists concerned that they should never have been brought back. I don't buy that at all. I'd love to see dinosaurs brought back.
One last question. Thanks, Lauren.
First, let me say a few comments. First of all, I'm really delighted to see you here in Brooklyn and that you're recovering well. And I also want to thank you for your support of two organizations I've been proudly associated with for years, First, the National Center for Science Education, and then secondly, the World Science Festival. I'd like to ask you, as one former evolutionary biologist to one of our great leaders of evolutionary biology, what do you see in the horizon that will really interest you in terms of evolutionary biology's development as a major scientific field over the course of this century?
I didn't quite hear all that, I'm afraid. Did you get it?
I think the question was, I missed part of it, but...
Well, I'm asking, what do you see in evolution biology fundamentally now that that really excites you, that you think will be a key part of what we're doing in evolution biology for the rest of the century?
First, I'm glad you mentioned the National Center for Science Education, NCSE, which is based in Oakland, California, and has for many years been doing magnificent work under Eugenie Scott, who's just retired and handed the baton on to somebody else. This organization has been highly influential in fostering evolutionary education, court cases fighting against the attempts to suppress it. They've recently switched their emphasis to climate change, and that's going to be very, very important in the next 4 years at least, probably longer than that. But to your question, what are the exciting things that are going on at the moment? I think they're mostly concerned with DNA. The fact that DNA sequencing is now, as I said before, so cheap and quick means that it is possible to get the DNA sequence of a very large number of species. And so potentially we could be looking at a complete tree of life, of all life, the complete pedigree of all life. We know that all life is descended from a single common ancestor because the DNA code, the code that relates DNA sequence to protein sequence, is universal, all but universal. So we're all cousins. Every living creature is a cousin of every other living creature. And DNA sequencing gives us the chance to actually draw the tree of life. That's a bit of a tall order quantitatively because the number of species is so large, up in the tens of millions, that if you were to draw it out on a sheet of paper, the family tree, the sheet of paper would be of a size comparable to a planetary orbit. The sheet of paper would be so enormous. So the only way to do it is as a fractal. Do it on a computer screen where you can zoom around, you can fly around the family tree of all life, and from time to time, if you like, drill down to a particular detail. And this has been done with a splendid piece of software called OneZoom, written by James Rosendell and Yan Wong. Yan is the co-author of the second edition of The Ancestor's Tale, my book, The Ancestor's Tale. And The Ancestor's Tale has lots and lots of family trees based upon OneZoom. So look up OneZoom. It's a trip. It really is amazing. And this is an example of the kind of thing that's now possible, the really exciting things that are going on in the DNA world. Really because DNA is digital. So modern biology, especially evolutionary biology and genetics, has become a branch of information technology.
Before we escort Richard to the signing table, and I hope you won't mob him before we get there, please feel welcome to mob